Tonight we ask, how can we make sure the recovery from the pandemic is green? How should we confront the challenge of the climate after COVID? A very good evening. Well, today we learnt that the UK's Climate Assembly wants the recovery from coronavirus to be green. Polluting new cars, it thinks, should be banned in as little as 10 years' time. And people should be encouraged to eat much less dairy and meat. The question is, though, whether we're ready to make those sacrifices. Well, tonight on Climate After COVID, a green recovery, we're going to be exploring the climate choices facing us and the potential solutions which deliver green growth. With me to do that is our very special panel. They're assembled from right across the world. We'll meet them in a moment or two. And also with us a virtual international audience, truly international, who'll be questioning them and letting us know their views. Oh, yes, they will. Hello and good evening to you all. Give us a wave. Well, lots of work for them tonight. But first, let's get a stock take on the current state of climate change from a country where it's pretty much impossible to ignore its very clear effects. We're talking about Iceland. It lies close to the Arctic Circle, and about 11% of the country is covered by glaciers. Well, those glaciers are predicted to lose up to 35% of their present volume within half a century or so. Now, if melted, they alone would raise global sea levels by 1 centimetre. Well, that's the future challenge. But in the present one, the country's health has been relatively unaffected by coronavirus, with only about 1% of the population infected so far. But the impact on Iceland's economy has been very different, with visitor numbers down 80% this year. Sky's Adam Parsons reports from one of the country's most endangered locations.
Welcome to Vatnajökull ice cap. It is a hard place to reach, but when you get here, it is captivating. On this island of ice and fire, the ice here is discoloured by volcanic ash sprinkled over it by an eruption a decade ago. The glacier can survive that, but what might kill it is us. As the world has warmed, so the ice in Vatnajökull has melted faster and faster. Over the past 90 years, this whole glacier has receded by 5 miles. Sneva Gudmundsson has been studying it for decades.
It's devastating, actually. It's surprising to see how fast this happens.
Around him, this glacier is eroding before our eyes, a very obvious victim of climate change. Water is gushing into this huge lagoon. It was only formed 86 years ago, but from here you can see how the glacier is falling. Icebergs that have broken away, and this. An ice cave collapsing as we watched. As long as the world is getting warmer, the glaciers will retreat. In a century or two, Iceland could have very little ice. This new giant lake, the ice, the cliffs where the glacier once soared, they're all a warning about the fragility of our ecosystem. The question is whether the world is paying attention.
Well, clearly a stunning place, and Adam Parsons is live on that glacier in Iceland right now and joins me now. So, as I say there, Adam, a stunning place, but a stunning rate of loss of ice as well.
Yeah, that is right. The sun is about to set here over Vatnajökull. It is an extraordinary, otherworldly scene. I have to say, this area has that sense of brutality of nature, but also of fragility, because this glacier is melting at a pretty extraordinary rate. Look at those cliffs up there. They're about 300 metres tall. That's the same height as London's tallest building, the Shard. A century ago, the ice went right up to the top of them. And if you look into the distance, you can see, what, 5 miles away, 6 miles away, the glacier used to extend all that way. And yet it has melted over those 100 years. Why? Well, because the world has got hotter, and when ice heats up, then it melts. In just the time I've been talking to you, less than a minute, it's estimated that about 7 million litres of ice have melted from this glacier alone. And that feels to me like a pretty stark warning to the world.
Astonishing. What a sight. Thank you, Adam. Well, from the freezer to the fire, quite literally, our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, is tonight in Para in Brazil, where they're fighting fires in the Amazon rainforest once again. Stuart, yet more evidence of the human effects on climate change.
It would certainly seem to be suggested by the heat that's here, Dermot. That's the rainforest behind me. I'm just going to step out of the way. It's on fire. It's as simple as that. There's no other way of putting it. We're surrounded by fires. We're just going to keep focusing on these. Occasionally the trees will just go alight. We've been in here, this region, and inside the forest today and yesterday as well, with the fire brigade who are trying to control the fires here. There are just 5 of them, Dermot, and they've got literally hundreds of thousands of hectares to look after. What they're doing at the moment, they're still in there, is trying to build a fire wall to stop the spread of the flames into the trees. But it's a difficult battle. This fire's been going on for a week or so. Now, if we come down from this, you'll see one of the reasons why these fires start. Everything you can see in front of me is cattle land. It's a massive blaze that was here. That's all burnt, as you can see. And as we've seen many times over the years, but very bad last year, and they think this year could be even worse. It spreads into the forest. The farmer who's been here with his father for over 20 years says that it's simply the climate. It is hot, hot, hot. It doesn't rain. It's been at least 3 months. And basically, climate change, he says, is the reason for all of this.
Stuart, thank you very much indeed. Stuart Ramsey there in the rainforest in Brazil. Well, as we've just seen 2 examples of there, the impact of climate change is being felt in so many countries right across the planet. And our audience tonight is also international. We've got people from India, Russia, Iceland, Zambia, Nigeria, Ghana and the United States, as well as the United Kingdom and Ireland. So, audience, I want to get you working. I've got a first question for you, and it's this one about priorities. Which issue do you think should take precedence right now? Coronavirus or the climate? Now, hands up, let's choose one of them. Hands up if you believe, one hand please, if you believe that coronavirus is the pressing priority. Quarter, mid 25, maybe 30%, something like that. Think it's coronavirus. So we can assume, given you all want to take part here, that the rest of you think it should be climate change. Well, it's not just our virtual audience that we've been questioning about this. A Sky News poll carried out by YouGov for us asked people to tell us what they think the government's priorities should be. Well, these are some of the results, and it's almost a mirror image, a flip of what our virtual audience have said. 67% said the coronavirus pandemic and just 15% said climate change. The rest said neither, or that they weren't entirely sure. Now, those findings are going to be, of course, of much interest to our panel. Let me introduce them formally then. They are Claire O'Neill, Minister for Energy and Clean Growth until last year, when she was asked to run the next big global meeting to address climate change, COP26, a nomination that was later withdrawn. We've got Salim Al-Haq, is one of the world's most prominent climate scientists and director of the International Centre for Climate Change and Developments, joined by Audrey Gallagher, served on the advisory board to the Climate Assembly and is Deputy Chief Executive of Energy UK. Our quartet is completed with Bjorn Lomborg, the author of The Sceptical Environmentalist. He doesn't argue that climate change isn't happening, but says it isn't an apocalyptic threat. Well, let's hear from you all first off then. And Claire O'Neill, this issue of priorities, the difference between our audience and the polling. But on the polling, 2/3 of people think we really should be dealing with coronavirus as a priority.
Well, honestly, I'm not that surprised by that, Dermot, because, we have had nightly hourly news for the last 6 months of the coronavirus threat. You know, it has been, you've been reporting it constantly. It's something that everyone has been talking about. We've had the whole economy shut down, and we haven't had anything like the same coverage of the climate crisis and the fact that we currently have, you know, the highest level of state fires burning in California. We have cities around the developing world running out of water, and we have record temperatures now right across the globe. And I also think there is a bit of a problem with this, that, you know, climate change can feel a bit separated from us in terms of space and time. It's that classic kind of tragedy of the commons. But, you know, the climate layer is 60 miles thick. That's it. And we've been conducting an uncontrolled chemical experiment with that layer collectively for the last 100 years that isn't going to end very well unless we start to do something about it. So I'm not surprised by that polling. I think we need to all work, and I really commend you actually for doing this programme, to make people realise that this change is happening, but that it isn't apocalyptic. You know, this is potentially the world's biggest economic opportunity. Climate recovery is both something that's absolutely necessary and something will completely transform the way that we live and do business, and we need to get on with it.
We're going to be hearing a lot from you all during the course of this programme. Salim ul-Haq, your thoughts on those findings, on the public's view?
Well, I think it's natural that people are concerned about the public health crisis that is actually affecting them, their families, and people are in fact dying immediately. On the other hand, climate change is a longer-term problem, but it is a big, big, big problem. And speaking from Dhaka in Bangladesh, I can tell you right now, part of the country is flooded. It's one of the biggest floods we've had in decades. And just a couple of months ago, we had a super cyclone that attacked our coast in the middle of a pandemic. So the crises aren't an either or. There are multiple crises that all have to be dealt with at the same time.
Bjorn Lomborg, what are your thoughts? I mean, do you think, perhaps, maybe you do, that the public are right in that ordering of priorities?
Well, I would be more likely to agree with Salimul. So fundamentally, we don't prioritize problems. We prioritize solutions, and we need to realize they're great COVID solutions where we can spend little money and do an amazing amount of saving people's lives. We should definitely do those. There are pretty poor COVID solutions where we spend lots of resources and save almost no one. We should definitely not be doing those. And it's the same with climate. There's some great climate solutions, and we should be doing those. There are some really bad, ineffective climate solutions. We shouldn't be doing those. So it's not about prioritizing climate versus COVID. It's about making sure we do the smart COVID solutions and the smart climate solutions and don't do all the dumb ones.
OK, we're going to be discussing a lot about those possible solutions during the course of the hour and more. But let me ask you then, Audrey Gallagher, it's about the government's attention, I suppose, in terms of priorities. What are your thoughts?
So I think obviously the government's going to have to deal with the immediate effects of the pandemic, and you know, we've got a public health crisis on our hands. They really need to get that under control. But after that, the recovery from COVID, we're not talking about a binary choice here. We can do both. And in fact, you mentioned the Climate Assembly. They have said quite clearly that in the recovery coming out of COVID, we've got to ensure that what we do is going to contribute towards meeting the net zero targets. And we're already hearing the government talking about building back better. You know, we're going to have a clean, green recovery. And I really want to see that happen. I think it's possible. And that's what we should be aiming for. But of course, you know, we need to deal with this public health crisis first.
OK, your opening thoughts. Thank you very much indeed for them. Let's get the opening question then from our audience. It comes from Dominic Panaya from London. Very good evening to you, Dominic. Identify yourself. There you are. Please ask your question. Put your question to the panel.
Given that governments across the world have proved how quickly they can deal with a global emergency with no expense spared, will they now do the same for the so-called climate emergency?
Very good and interesting question. Salim, you come in first on this. This is about, I suppose, will and application. If the climate crisis is real, why aren't governments acting with such speed and the amount of money that they are over COVID?
Thank you very much, Dermot. Please call me Salim. It's easier to pronounce. Yes,
Thank you.
I think even though the coronavirus is not related to climate change, there is a very, I think, important message that is a very common message that we are seeing play out in dealing with the coronavirus situation, which is leaders who listen to their scientists and the epidemiologists and took action at the right time, ended up saving lives. And the leaders, and we don't need to name them, we know who they are, who did not do that, who refused to listen to the science, have ended up being responsible for deaths by the thousands, indeed hundreds of thousands of their own citizens. And that is a lesson that we need to apply to the climate change crisis as much as well, because the scientists are telling us what to do. Leaders, some are taking the actions required, and I'll mention the Prime Minister of New Zealand as a good example, and some, and Mr. Trump of the United States is an example, aren't. And that is going to play out to everybody's detriment going forward. So listen to the scientists, do actions as quickly as possible, and I agree with Bjorn. If they are cost effective, do them quickly. That's really what we need to be doing. Thank you.
Well, OK, well, let's bring in Bjorn then. And your thoughts on that question. Address it directly, if you will, from Dominic Panaya there. And he's saying, well, look at the amount of money governments all around the world are spending on coronavirus. They've correctly identified it as a crisis. And the fact with climate change, they've been calling it a crisis for years, but not acting in at the same speed, not spending the same amount of money.
Yeah. So, Dominic, you're absolutely right. We're spending an enormous amount of money. Remember, it's mostly money we don't have and we probably actually can't afford. So I think we should be very wary of whether we're actually going to spend them well just for Corona. But the real issue, of course, is how do we then get governments to spend money smartly for climate? And that has to be about making sure that we don't just spend lots and lots of resources on stuff that looks good, that makes everyone feel like, oh, we're doing something. One great example of how we're wasting resources is when we subsidize, for instance, electric cars. That is an incredibly ineffective way to mostly pay rich people to drive around these virtuous cars, but cut very, very little CO2. On the other hand, if we could get a lot of countries to switch, at least first, from coal to gas, we could dramatically drive down carbon emissions at very low cost. So it's about making sure that we spend resources in places where we can cut lots of CO2 at low cost rather than doing the opposite.
OK, what the question is directly asking, though, Claire O'Neill, is, I suppose, are governments really just paying lip service to climate change, because we've seen how fast and how effectively they can act when they see people dying?
Well, the short answer to Dominic's great question is no, they will not turn the taps on and spend the money, and they won't do that for three reasons. One is, as Bjorn said, that money is very short, and the politics are that if you see an NHS in the UK overwhelmed with patients, that's incredibly bad for your electoral prospects. If you don't stop climate emissions going up, people don't really notice. And so the short-termism of the government cycle, the average prime minister globally is in place for about 4 years, means that this just simply is not a priority. And I spent, several years as the minister. I brought in the UK's net zero legislation. We had wonderful support, actually, particularly from Prime Minister Theresa May. But, we were in a place for many years where it was not taken particularly seriously by governments. And I'll just point out that you mentioned, Dermot, that I was the president designate of the COP process. This is the annual climate gathering, the thing that led to the Paris Agreement. That's been running, was set up in 1992 in Rio, and since those enormously expensive, huge conferences are happening, emissions have gone up by about 40%. So there's an awful lot of intergovernmental talking, and there's not a lot of action. Is it all gloom and doom there? Well, no, because the question assumes that it's only governments that tackle stuff like this. And I've got a logo up behind me. I don't know if you can see it. I've taken on a new job at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, because while governments are doing some amazing things and setting out net zero targets, the world's biggest corporations, who understand that if they don't start investing and don't start taking this seriously, there will be a huge problem, are starting to move.
And that kind of expertise is why you're with us. It's why you're all with us. Audrey Gallagher, on this issue of government's will and action, is it the fact that coronavirus just hit us with such speed and that, in a way, climate change is creeping up on us?
So clearly we've seen that there had to be a response to that. I think, though, as we mentioned before, it does represent a good opportunity to now try and take some action, ensure that we can address climate change. The government's going to have to go out and borrow lots and lots of money for the recovery from COVID. Let's make sure that any fiscal stimulus packages that are going in place, as Bjorn said, we're doing it in a sustainable way. We're investing in technology in sectors where there's a real future and we can tackle climate change. This is offered as an opportunity. I think people have also seen that they can live differently, because the whole thing about climate change, tackling climate change, of course, we need government intervention, we need plans from them. We need a kind of clear policy framework in order to bring forward investment. But there's also going to have to be a significant change to people's behaviour. And I think that's something that we just haven't really started the conversation with people around that. People don't really understand what this might mean for them. And I think we have to do that as well as just relying on government. This is not something that governments can deliver. Claire mentioned bringing in businesses, but we need to take the public with us as well. Everybody's going to have to change significantly to get this done.
OK, well, let's get on. Thank you all for that. But let's get on to this climate assembly, because it's one thing to accept that climate change is still, despite coronavirus, the most pressing issue facing the world. It's quite another, perhaps, to agree on what to do about it. Well, as we've heard, the UK Climate Assembly, which reported today, wants some significant changes. Let's take you through just some of its suggestions. Nearly 4 in 5 of the Climate Assembly members, 79%, nearly 80%, agreed that the recovery from COVID should be green. And these are some of the actions to get there. 80% of them recommended that taxes for flying should increase as people fly more often or further. Frequent flyers should be penalised. They also say people voluntarily should reduce their meat and dairy consumption by up to 40%. So, are people prepared to make those kind of sacrifices and many others? Our Sky News poll for this programme suggests, well, it depends. The most popular policy to aid a green recovery was continued encouragement for people to work from home, with 64%, nearly 2/3 in favour, versus just 20% opposed. Now, that idea of encouraging people to eat less dairy and meat was the least popular that we tested, with just 33%, a third, in favour. 53% were opposed to that suggestion, and there was little confidence in UK political leaders over climate change when we asked who people thought cared the most out of Boris Johnson, Keir Starmer, Nicola Sturgeon and the leader of the Lib Dems, Ed Davey. 35% said none of the above. Well, let's bring in our audience right here. And I want to ask you, what do you make of that poll? Let's get your hands up again. Would you like to see action, for example, to encourage people to eat less meat and dairy produce? Would you like to see that actively discouraged by governments? And nearly all of you, just stay with us and let me ask you a slightly different version of that. Are you making efforts yourselves right now to do that, to change your diets? OK, so more than half, but a few of you then want a bit of encouragement from your governments. And on the subject of encouraging better behaviour versus enforcing it is our next question. This comes from Danny Hurley in Clitheroe. Hello there, Danny. Please put your point to our panel.
Hi, everyone. Given the government's draconian approach to tackling the pandemic, would a more authoritarian solution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions be more effective than a liberal one?
Well, Danny, very good question. Let's see what our panellists make of this. Bjorn Lomborg, well, we've heard just in the last few days in the UK about COVID marshals, laws to stop people gathering in groups above 6. It's the law. People will be penalised. People will be fined. Who knows? People may go to jail. What about when it comes to the climate then? We've got COVID marshals. Couldn't we have climate change marshals telling people to recycle and turn their engines off?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, there's actually been quite a number of people suggesting this, but ethically, I can't imagine that anyone would really support this. You can't say that you want to have a democracy, but then for some things, you actually want to be authoritarian. I think we need to recognize that this is something where we have to convince people to do this on the merits of the proposals, which, of course, again, goes back to saying, look, you really only need an authoritarian government if you're going to carry through policies that people wouldn't otherwise support. That's why we need to find solutions that people will actually support rather than going in the other direction and say we should go authoritarian. I think that's a terrible argument.
What do you think, Audrey Gallagher?
Yeah, I think it would be an absolute disaster if we tried to impose this on people, because you're talking about, up until now we've done a big job of decarbonising the power supply in the country. But you don't notice when you switch the light on that you're using greener electricity. The changes that are going to be required are going to be quite significant about, as you've outlined, how much you travel, what you're allowed, what you eat. That can't be imposed on people. And I think what the Climate Assembly has shown is that if you educate people, if you give them the information, then they can start making some of the trade-offs and make some of the choices. And that's going to be really, really important. But I think probably the most important thing out of all of this is fairness. So, there is an issue about it's going to be difficult to reach net zero, but how we do it, not if we do it, is going to be just as important, because this is coming at a significant impact on people's lives, potentially at a significant cost. And we need to make sure that that's borne properly. And we need to take people with us in order to do that, because it is a huge undertaking.
Right. I know, I'm going to go back to Danny and say, you asked the question. By asking it, was it the fact that you actually would like to see governments legislate, perhaps put into law, criminalise a behaviour that affects the climate?
No, I understand that authoritarian is a very strong word, and I agree with what the panellists have said. But if I was to define the Liberal approach to being the Paris Agreement, I think it was Emily O'Neill who said that since the Paris Agreement was introduced, that emissions have increased 40%. So the reason why that's failed, in my opinion, is because the Paris Agreement it relies on nationally determined contributions. So in effect, countries can choose their own targets, they can set their own targets. So that to me proves that targets can be missed, they are being missed. So banning certain uses of fossil fuels would surely be the most effective way to do it. And to do it by deadline would allow a smoother economic transition as well.
Well, great question. Thank you very much indeed for that, Danny, and a great answer, which, has got all our panellists, I don't know if you can all see each other, but all nodding in agreement that perhaps it's got to be carrot and not stick. Thank you very much indeed for that contribution, Danny from Clitheroe. Now, we want to discuss another, and it flows directly from the issue of coronavirus in the steps that are being taken to try to deal with it. We've got Miranda Collett, who lives in Jersey, who wants to ask a very specific question, don't you, Miranda? Put it to us, please.
OK, I'm concerned about the plastic waste that's accumulating through PPE and disposable masks and gloves. The pandemic seems to have set the anti-plastic movement back a few years. Is there anyone dealing with this? And how are PPE items recycled?
Yeah, and just while I'm with you, Miranda, I mean, you're on Jersey, as I say, you must see the effects of plastic waste on the shores every day.
We certainly do, yeah. Luckily, some of us regularly pick up all the plastic around our beaches.
Good for you. OK, well, let me put that point to Claire O'Neill. And I mean, there is a huge amount. We're talking about billions of individual items, single-use items of PPE being discarded on a daily basis around the world. And we hear today in the United Kingdom an ambition, for instance, to carry out something like 10 million coronavirus tests per day. They presumably will be disposable. That's an awful lot more plastic. What are your thoughts, Claire O'Neill?
Well, I think it's a great question. A couple of years ago, when we had, actually, I think Sky did a lot of coverage on this when we had the great Blue Ocean series. We got really concerned about the long-term impact of plastic waste, and we made huge progress, actually, both in the UK and elsewhere. And I've been very struck by the fact that you see a lot of discarded masks. You can no longer use reusable coffee cups. We all carried those around to try and do our bit. And I think this is a fabulous question because it shows the kind of unintended unintended consequences of some of these decisions. The good news is a lot of this stuff is incinerated. I mean, I know there are questions about air quality, but when it's used in hospital settings, it tends to be incinerated. And I think we have to encourage people to actually start again as citizens using their own reusable things. And can you bear with it, Dermot? If I just go back, I wanted to go back to Danny's question just for 10 seconds. Having brought in a number of laws in the climate space, you can't be authoritarian as a government, but you can lead. And things like the banning of fossil fuel vehicles on our roads, which Audrey's Climate Assembly thought was a really good thing, that was actually the most controversial thing that we did in the last few years. And so I think governments have a massive role to play in leading on this. And it's been rather depressing that none of the government leaders or none of my old mates around the cabinet table, I think, have ever mentioned publicly the issue of plastic waste, having made such a focus of it. So I do think we need governments to recognise this problem and come up with some solutions. This is a simple solution.
Just want a quick thought from Salim. I mean, again, you must see in Bangladesh the effects of plastic pollution in the oceans on a daily basis. And this coronavirus pandemic is only making it worse, but is it a necessary evil?
Well, definitely we see this. But interestingly, Bangladesh was one of the first countries to ban plastic bags use in Dhaka city. We don't use plastic bags here anymore because it's been banned, and everybody's now gone to using other kinds of bags instead. So it is possible to get people to change and change behavior. But if I can also address the previous question for a minute, which is that one of the things that we can definitely look at, and I'll pick the example that Bjorn gave of in his view, a wrong kind of subsidy for electric vehicles. In my view, an even bigger wrong subsidy is for the fossil fuel companies. These companies are getting huge subsidies from their own exchequers. And that, to me, is not just wrong, that's criminal. That should not be allowed. How the hell can we give subsidies to the polluters? That is absolutely unacceptable in this day and age.
Well, you got an awful lot. I don't know if you can see our audience there, but they're certainly agreeing with you. Many of them, I think, well, the vast majority of them are clapping along there with that. Well, listen, got a lot to get through, and we've had a real sense there of the difficult choices facing societies and governments right now. And one society, perhaps more significant in this than anywhere else, has to make its own choice about the future on November the 3rd. We know where we're going, don't we? The United States debate about climate is starkly split between President Trump and Joe Biden. The challenger, Mr. Biden, is partly influenced by more radical voices on the left of his party, the Democrats. And one of them, prospective Congressman Jamal Bowman, told me his country could take on the virus and rescue the climate at the same time.
We're living through the greatest crisis in our nation's history since the Great Depression. We're also living through a period similar to the Spanish flu, as well as the civil rights movement, as well as economic and education catastrophe and climate catastrophe. So I believe we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Listen, before the pandemic, before the coronavirus, climate change was ravaging communities throughout the world.
But what about questions such as the financial realities of dealing with COVID, the billions upon billions, ultimately trillions of dollars that have been spent? Whoever's in power in the United States next January, the cupboard's going to be bare. Isn't the money just not going to be there for this transition to a truly green economy?
When we have our values rooted in the right place, we invest where we need to invest. When we wanted to put a man on the moon, we were able to do that. When we wanted to bail out the big banks in 2008, we were able to do that. The real question is, do we have the resources? Do we have the human capital and the resources to not just get out of this pandemic, but to build a nation in the world that works for everyone? And the answer is yes. We have millions upon millions of men, women, and children ready, willing, and able to get to work.
What would you say to those developing countries? You say, listen, this is all well and good coming from the mighty United States, which built its economy on the back of fossil fuels. And now you're saying, you won't do trade deals with us or whatever sanctions would be applied. If we go down the same route, we have to follow it the green way, and it's going to take us longer and be more expensive.
This is about us working in collaboration with them, being clear on what the needs are, and then taking a bottom-up strategy, similar to what we're doing here in our district in the Northeast Bronx and Westchester. There are communities, historically neglected communities, that haven't been a part of this democratic, economic, climate conversation, and we're going to pull them in, let them have a seat at the table, and make sure their voices and their needs are centered.
Joe Biden isn't as radical as you are when it comes to the climate. He's a centrist. He's cautious. He's going to be hearing a lot of voices if he wins those votes in the Rust Belt saying, listen, we don't want to make wind turbines. We just want to get back to the steel industry or whatever it is. He doesn't share your vision.
Well, Joe Biden is not King Joe Biden. He is elected by the people of this country, and he has already begun to move to the left on the issue of climate change. I believe he's committed $1 trillion over the next 10 years to fight the battle of climate change. A lot more needs to be done there, but he has already moved to the left.
And what about the other potential outcome? What if it's a second term for Donald Trump, who has in the past said that he thinks climate change is a hoax? What happens then?
You know, it's interesting. There's been a recent study by the financial industry on the impact of climate change to financial markets. Donald Trump commissioned that study. So although he says publicly that he doesn't believe in climate change and that it's a hoax, the fact that that study was commissioned and now we're looking at the impact on financial markets leads me to believe that Donald Trump, the Republican Party, and those who may deny the climate catastrophe publicly, privately, they understand the ramifications of it and are looking at it all from a financial markets perspective. So again, if Trump wins, we will continue to fight and do the work that we currently do. No matter how much Trump tries to change this nation into a fascist nation, we will not let him, and the people in the streets will not let him, and we will demand what needs to be done for climate and every other issue of justice in our nation.
Well, my interview with Jamal Bowman there, and we clearly know which side of the political landscape he sits. But what about our audience? Now, I suspect I already know the answer to this question I'm going to put to you, because I saw the look on your faces there when we discussed Donald Trump and the applause you just gave Mr. Bowman there at the end of the interview. But let me ask you, put up your hands if you think Donald Trump's re-election would be the best thing for the world's climate. Hands up if you think Donald Trump's re-election would be the best thing for the world's climate. Right, well, OK. Well, what's that, 2%? Well, 2, that's 4%, 50 of you, obviously. 2, 3, perhaps. And some with your heads in your hands. So that would be a negative vote, if you could. Well, let's ask our panellists there. A very small proportion thinking that Donald Trump is serious when it comes to his protestations about taking climate change seriously. Of course, as I mentioned with Jamal Bowman there, he's also called it a hoax. So, Audrey Gallagher, would it be an enormous setback for the fight against climate change if President Trump is re-elected?
So I was personally really disappointed when I seen that America had pulled out the Paris Agreement, notwithstanding what we've spoken about the Paris Agreement on climate on the panel already. This is a global issue, and it's a real concern that the world's biggest economy isn't on board with tackling it, because it needs to be tackled globally. I think there's no doubt that there are issues. Our government probably worries about the competitiveness and industrial competitiveness. But I think if we do this properly, if you bring investment forward in a sensible way, we can actually create jobs. You can reskill people. You can find new jobs and we can develop technology. We could be a world leader. We have been a world leader on things like offshore wind and how quickly we've brought the costs down of that and developed new technologies. And I can see the same happening again with other emerging technology. And I think that's what we really need to focus on. Loads of countries out there are coming up with their own plans about, the European Union has got a Green Deal. I do think we've got some challenges around about, we can't just offshore some of these emissions. There's a lot of work to be done on, carbon border taxes and stuff like that to make sure that we don't do that. But there's no, there's no option not to do nothing here, and that's why it's, I'm pleased that our country has taken a bold step to put the net zero target in place by 2050. Somebody has to take some leadership.
Bjorn Lomborg, what are your thoughts? Would it be a disaster for the fight against climate change if you get a president re-elected who thinks that things like wind turbines cause cancer, that fracking is a great thing?
Well, look, fundamentally, we don't need Donald Trump's climate policies. I think all of us in the panel agree on that. But the real issue, and I think that's what we need to sort of step back, and you also asked that question to Bowman, is to recall that most of the rich world is actually a fairly small part of the emissions in the 21st century. So if the US went carbon neutral tomorrow, which of course won't happen, and stayed carbon neutral for the rest of the century, it would, if you put it into the UN climate models, reduce temperature by the end of the century by 0.2 degrees, or a little less than that. It would probably not even be measurable. The most part of the emissions that we're going to see in the 21st century, is about 3/4, are going to come from China, India, Africa, Latin America, the world's poor countries right now. And they, of course, want to get richer. They are not likely to be willing to spend many trillions of dollars. And I think that tells us what matters is not so much who wins, although I would like Biden to win, but it's much, much more about making sure that we pick the right targets. That is, invest dramatically more in green energy R&D into zero carbon energy technologies. Because if we can make green energy cheaper than fossil fuels, everyone will switch, not just rich, well-meaning countries, but also everyone in Latin America, in Africa, in China, and in India. So I think we should stop focusing so much on the US and remember the real challenge is to get the world's poor.
It's a global challenge, of course it is, and we got a global audience, and 54 of us participating. If you leave me out, I'm the moderator in this discussion, 50 on our panel, and we've identified the one person who thinks that Donald Trump would be a world leader when it comes to climate change. Mahan, there you are.
Hello.
Why do you think that?
Well, if we phrase the question as, would it be better to leave climate change in the hands of the private sector or the government? I think that's a question for particularly Audrey or Claire, who recently tweeted about something like this. So I'd like to know their opinions on that, please.
We will find that very soon. You've done your research. That's why you're there. Thank you very much indeed for that, Mahan. We want to talk about jobs, though, as well. And I will put those points to Claire and Audrey, because one of the questions for both those aspiring to become US president and run governments like the UK's is whether new green jobs can quickly replace those lost during the course of this awful pandemic. Well, here in the UK alone, our Sky News job tracker shows that at least 129,000 jobs have been lost since the start of the pandemic. More than 30,000 of them lost in the aviation sector alone. Well, now compare that with the finding of a new report by the IPPR think tank. Now, it suggests that low-carbon, energy-efficient social home building could generate something like 560,000 jobs, maybe more than that, it says. In fact, the think tank claims that more than 1.6 million jobs could be created through investing in low-carbon projects and programmes over the next decade. Well, let's get a question on that subject, and it comes from Andrew Lound from Birmingham, of course, formerly the workshop of the UK, workshop of the world, knows an awful lot about manufacturing, I suspect. Andrew, good to talk to you. What is your question?
Good evening. Yeah, with Japan and Sweden actively supporting hydrogen and fuel cell technology, how can the public be sure that the true innovation, such as hydrogen and fuel cell technology, is going to be actually supported in the UK, especially the Midlands, rather than simply being blocked and frustrated by government and the vested interests?
OK, well, comparing with Japan and Sweden, Claire O'Neill, does the UK take these new technologies, their potential for jobs and, of course, reduction of CO2 emissions, does it take it seriously?
Yes, massively so. I mean, we have about 250,000 people working directly in the low carbon economy in the UK now, and that number's growing very rapidly every year. And those jobs are everywhere from Aberdeen to Cornwall. That's a bigger sector than the aviation sector. We just don't talk about it. And Andrew, you should be really proud of the fact that thanks to some amazing work done by the former government, still the Conservative government, but the former one, we actually set up some incredible innovation around fuel cell batteries, because we don't just want to assemble cars in the UK, we want to make the batteries that actually go into the electric cars. And there was £250 million invested in a thing called the Faraday Challenge. And also in hydrogen, there are lots and lots of efforts going on to actually try and drop the cost of hydrogen. But look, frankly, what we need a bit more of is a bit more public-private cooperation in this space. And just to go back to that question, the private sector can't do this alone. You've got to have regulation. You've got to have things like, in fact, I think carbon border taxes are a great way of dealing with some of the really high emitting economies who then want to dump their steel on some of the countries that are really trying to clean up their act. But, you know, the private sector can see innovation and can move so much more quickly in many cases than governments. And you need these partnerships. But yes, this green stuff, this clean growth was at the forefront of the UK's industrial strategy. And that work does continue. And by the way, Birmingham is a fantastic place for the innovation that sector needs.
Yeah. But Salim, as we've discussed, this is a global problem and it needs a global response. And on these technologies, is there a danger that the developing world gets left out? Doesn't it need the developed world, the UK's, the United States, the EU's and the rest of them, to invest not just in their own countries, but in countries like Bangladesh as well?
Yes, indeed. But I think, you know, the old paradigm is now history, where we in the developing world used to think these were burdens on us. It isn't true anymore. We are now also forging ahead on renewable energy. And let me cite my country's example. We have the biggest household solar energy system in the world, about 5 million households providing solar energy to 20 million people who weren't getting electricity before that. They were burning kerosene in the night, and that has enhanced the quality of life of very, very poor people living all over the country in rural Bangladesh. So technological leaps and developments are not confined to the developed world, and they don't need to be brought from there to us. On the other hand, we can teach you how to cope with the impacts of climate change, because we know how to do that and you don't.
Bjorn Lomborg, do you have faith that these new technologies are out there and do and will provide solutions?
Oh, look, there are lots of solutions, and some of those, as Salim also mentioned, solar panels for very, very poor people who don't have any access. Wonderful thing, but it's not what's going to lift you out of poverty. And of course, at the same time as Bangladesh has gotten a lot of solar panels, they've also seen their emissions keep increasing. They have increased 15-fold over the last 50 years, because it is what drives development. And so what we really need is to make sure that the rich world, which is thinking of spending lots and lots of resources, don't spend it on subsidizing existing inefficient technology, but invest it in investing in new and research-generated solutions. So basically make sure we innovate new technologies that everyone will want to do. So Biden, for instance, he's promised a lot of stuff, and a lot of it is probably unaffordable, but he's actually promised to increase spending to $75 billion a year. That would be a 5-fold increase of what the world is currently doing on research and development into zero carbon energy technologies. That would be a fantastic opportunity, and that is what could help not only the rich world to deal with this, but also everyone else. Because obviously, you know, both people in Bangladesh and in Denmark and everywhere else would be using this.
Yeah. And let me ask you, let's just focus again on the UK, Audrey Gallagher. I mean, part of the reason it seems that the UK is having such a row with the EU over its negotiations over a trade deal is that it wants the freedom to invest, particularly in tech companies. Does that give you a sign that, and of course, it's technological solutions we're talking about, is that a sign to you that the UK government does take this seriously?
I think the government definitely takes it seriously. Claire's outlined some of the measures that have been put in place. Just recently, we've seen the industrial clusters around hydrogen, 5 of them across the whole country. So there's definitely stuff happening. And if I mentioned about the offshore wind sector that we've reduced emissions in the power generation sector by about 70% in the last 10 years, a massive success story. The only reason we were able to do that is because good policies get put in place, backed up by really strong environmental protections. It gave certainty, investors came forward, made that investment, developed the technology, brought the cost down massively. I think like the first round at auctions, it was £150, it's now less than 40. So huge benefits. So if we can take the lessons from that and apply them, then hopefully we can obtain the competitive advantage there, but also reduce emissions, make things cheaper for people. And I would just say as well, I know we're talking about technology, but actually really simple things like making our homes more energy efficient will create jobs up and down the country. It will massively reduce emissions. People will live in warmer homes, they'll be healthier, they'll save money. So as well as looking at the bright, shiny stuff, we need government to be looking at how we can do the basics.
Well, quite a lot of applause there. Thank you very much indeed. Where's the time gone? We've got to our final question, and this one comes from Elizabeth Babayemi from Falkirk, and it's all about these warm words, these aspirations, making sure that they're put into action. Put your question to the panel, Elizabeth. Very good to see you.
Thank you, Dermot. Do we need a new protocol order to safeguard the world? A cross-continent panel of youths, adults, and experts to evaluate the impact on climate after COVID and the way forward?
Great question, Elizabeth. Well, we've been talking about the Climate Assembly in the UK that has come forward with some possible solutions over the last few months. Let me put this to you then. Salim, first of all, do we need, I suppose, a new body, a new global body to think about solutions and perhaps enforce them as well?
Well, we already have a global body and we have the Paris Agreement, and we aren't seeing a lot of enforcement going on there. I believe in a more bottom-up approach, if you like, working from the bottom up, from people who are already thinking about the problem, and young people in particular, all over the world. In fact, the youth in Bangladesh are extremely engaged on this issue and are doing many, many things and connecting with youth around the world as well. So to me, a bottom-up, citizen-led approach, which would also take into account people taking action themselves and also holding their own leaders to account to make sure they have the right kind of leaders, and then the right kind of leaders take the right kind of decisions.
That's the point. Let me bring in Audrey Gallagher, because that is the point, isn't it? We saw you nodding along there. Of course, bottom up, whole population, citizens need to be involved, but do they also need to make sure, be allowed to make sure that what they recommend happens?
Yeah, so already there's letters have gone into the Prime Minister. The Bayes Select Committee is going to be doing an inquiry and looking at the recommendations that have come out of the Climate Assembly. And already, particularly because of the pace of change, the technology that's coming forward, there's calls for it to be repeated. And I think we definitely need to do that. We have to ensure that this gets done. The Committee on Climate Change does a brilliant job in our country. But there is a question about how do you replicate that and get it done on a global level. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer, and I'm really keen of, particularly any of the audience has got the panel members.
Right to be so. Claire O'Neill, you were nodding along there with the idea of a global climate assembly.
Well, I love the idea of the panel of youth experts and adults, but we already have a way to hold governments to account in democratic countries, and that's through the ballot box. And it is, quite alarming that certainly in the UK at the last election, climate, even though people really care about this, what mattered in the last election was Brexit. And secondly, use our green dollars. Companies around the world want to be making this change, want to invest in this change, but too many of us are not exercising our thoughts in the way that we make choices, the way that we spend money. And so I think I love the idea of having this citizens' assembly. I can't tell you how amazingly good the work is that was done. Audrey's team, it was super pragmatic, it was really commonsensical. It was the first time we've actually been able to get a really good representative view on what people think is right. But also, we don't vote about this. So we tend to think this is important, and then we all go back and start, worrying about other things. So for goodness sake, let's exercise that power we've got. There are lots of solutions out there, as has been said. People are taking this seriously. It's very hard to enforce these things internationally, but we can vote.
Bjorn Lomborg, would it just end up being just another talking shop? Isn't the UN and the existing global bodies, aren't they adequate?
Well, certainly we've got to be honest and say we've made lots and lots of promises the last 30 years, and we can see almost no impact. So the UN Environment Agency, UN Environment Program, last year told us that despite trillions of dollars spent, lots of people making lots of arguments, we can't actually see the difference in temperature or in emission trajectories. So really, we should ask ourselves, should we go on doing what has not worked for the last 30 years? Or do we need to find another way? And as Claire also pointed out, another way that can actually get a majority at the ballot box. And I think we need to do that by making sure we do something that's effective, that is reasonably cheap, so you can actually get people to vote for it and keep voting for it, and something that'll actually fix climate change. So as Samuel said, yes, absolutely, let's get rid of fossil fuel subsidies. Let's also make sure that we spend resources on innovation so that we can actually get the green revolution going. And then let's make sure that we also deal with all the other problems like COVID, as we started out talking about.
Well, thank you all very much indeed for that on the panel. Well, we're talking about getting people involved. Well, we've got our audience there, of course, haven't we? Let's involve you one more time in this television version of our debate. And let's put Elizabeth's question back to you. I want to ask you, do you agree that a global panel, something like the UK Climate Assembly, but on a global scale, don't know how many people would be involved in it, is one way forward? A global climate assembly. Hands up if you support an idea like that. I'm seeing some of you making up your mind. Started at about 3/4, now gone up to 80, 90%, I'd say there. One other question on that issue then. So you've got this assembly, it's sitting, it's deliberating, it's coming up with its suggestions. It's going to worry the governments aren't going to act on it. Do you think it should be given, I don't know how it would happen, but just, we haven't got much time, it should be given some enforcement powers? Hands up if you think it should. Again, three-quarters, slightly less. Well, and there we must end it. Thank you very much indeed to all our wonderful audience and our wonderful, thoughtful and erudite panel, may I say. Thank you all. And that was Climate After COVID, a green recovery. And the debate's going to continue on Sky News digital platforms. Now, we're going to be putting more of your questions, plenty of them coming in, as well as more from our audience. They're staying with us, to our panel. You can see that show continue on the Sky News website. It's also there on our mobile app and indeed on our YouTube channel as well. And as part of that, we're going to be hearing in just a moment or two from one of the stars, a great comedian of the American version of The Office, on his conversion to the climate cause.
All I was doing was occasionally sending out an angry tweet. You know, I was what I call a slacktivist. And I knew that that wasn't going to cut it.